The knock came a little after 7 in the morning, and nobody answered it. Not the second knock, and not the third. The valet outside the bedroom door, at the Mayerling hunting lodge, had brought his master's shaving water and coffee at the same hour every day for years, and every day the Crown Prince had been awake before it arrived. That morning the room stayed silent. Through the keyhole there was nothing to see, only the curtains still drawn against the January dark, and the shape of the bed beyond them. The valet went for help, and the help he found was a count named Hoyos and a prince named Philip of Coburg, who happened to be at Mayerling that week as hunting guests, and who happened, though almost nobody watching them forced the door thought of it in that moment, to be married to the sister of the woman waiting back in Vienna for her husband to come home. They broke the door with an axe. Inside, on the bed, lay the only son of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, a pistol on the floor beside him, and beside him, already cold, already gone for hours, a 17-year-old girl named Mary Vetsera. He had shot her first. Then he had sat with her body, for what the doctors would later estimate was 6 hours, alone in that small room in the Vienna woods, before he shot himself. Mayerling itself had once been a Carthusian monastery, before Rudolf's father converted it into a hunting lodge for his son. A low, isolated building, set among fir trees a good hour's ride from Vienna, by the roads of the period, chosen precisely for the kind of privacy that made it useless as a place to keep a secret, once something had actually gone wrong inside it. Hoyos rode for help rather than send a servant, first to the nearest train station and then on to Vienna itself, where the news reached the imperial family's personal physician, Hermann Wiederhofer, before it reached almost anyone else, since the first working theory anyone dared consider, before the truth became unavoidable, was that the Crown Prince had suffered a sudden medical collapse rather than done anything to himself. That is the part of this story everyone already half knows. In the vague way, people know that a Crown Prince once died with his mistress in a hunting lodge, and that it was called a scandal, so enormous it still has a name of its own, Mayerling, spoken the way other centuries speak of Pompeii. What almost nobody asks is what happened at 10 in the morning that same day, when a telegram reached the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and a woman not yet 25 years old, a wife of not quite 8 years, was told that her husband had died suddenly in his sleep. That was the first lie she was given. It would not be the last. Over the following days she would be told a second version, and then eventually something closer to the truth, and at every stage of that unfolding she would be expected to grieve exactly the right amount, in exactly the right posture, for a marriage that had already been over, in every way that mattered for years, and for a man who had spent his last months writing love letters to another woman, while his wife slept 2 floors below him in the same palace. His death took him perhaps 4 seconds. What was demanded of her afterward, the composure, the silence, the accounting she had to give to a court that had never much liked her and now had every reason to blame her, took the rest of her life to pay off. She would eventually write a memoir and call it I Was to Be Empress, a title that reads, "Once you know how the story ends, less like a boast and more like an epitaph for a future that was taken from her twice, once by a gunshot in a hunting lodge, and once by the people who decided afterward what her marriage had really meant." Her name was Stephanie. She was a princess of Belgium before she was a crown princess of Austria, and understanding what Vienna did to her requires going back further than the bedroom door at Mayerling, back to a childhood spent trying to earn the attention of a father who treated his daughters as instruments of foreign policy and very little else, and to a wedding day when she was 16 years old, a girl who had been informed rather than asked, standing beside a groom who did not want to be there either, though for reasons that would take Stephanie years to fully understand. This is the story of what came after the 2 gunshots at Mayerling, the version most retellings skip because Rudolf and his mistress are the ones with the tragic, romantic, doomed love affair, and Stephanie is only ever the woman left holding the wreckage, expected by an entire empire to explain a marriage that was never really hers to explain. Stay with this one to the end, because the woman Vienna wrote off as the dull, humiliated wife turns out to have outlived every single person who humiliated her, and to have spent the back half of her life doing something almost nobody in her position ever managed to do, which was walking away. Consider what the court actually had to manufacture in the days after that door came off its hinges. A cause of death that could survive a telegram to every royal house in Europe. A funeral the Catholic Church could bless, despite rites that technically forbade it, to a man who had died by his own hand. A second body, a 17-year-old girl's, that had to disappear from the lodge before dawn and reappear at a convent burial ground, as though nothing about her death required any explanation at all. Every one of those problems got solved within about 48 hours by men who had never met Stephanie and felt no particular obligation to keep her informed while they solved them. She learned what her marriage had actually been and how her husband had actually died, roughly on the same schedule as the rest of the Viennese court, filtered through people who had their own reasons for deciding how much of it she needed to hear at once. And that was only the opening chapter of what Vienna would go on to ask of her. In the years that followed, she would be watched for how long she wore black and how quickly she smiled again, judged by a court that had already half decided, before she ever answered a single question, that a duller wife had somehow driven a golden crown prince into another woman's arms. Her own daughter would be raised largely out of her hands. Her own father would eventually disown her for the one marriage in her entire life she was allowed to choose for herself. And the woman most responsible for delivering her the truth about Mayerling, her own mother-in-law, would go down in history a full century later as one of Europe's most romantic, most sympathetically remembered empresses, while Stephanie herself became, in most retellings, barely a name attached to a scandal that was never really about her at all. None of that is the version most people know. Most people know Rudolf, tragic and doomed, and Mary, young and in love, a pairing so cinematic that filmmakers have been returning to it for the better part of a century. Almost nobody comes looking for the third person in that story, the wife who had to keep living in the palace where it happened, keep attending the funerals it caused, keep raising the daughter it left behind, long after the two more photogenic casualties of that January night had already been made into legend. On the morning the telegram reached Vienna, Stephanie had, by her own later account, been going about an entirely ordinary palace morning, dressing for the day, reviewing a schedule of visits, with no reason yet to suspect that anything about her life was about to be rewritten by people who had not bothered to ask her opinion of the rewrite. Before we go back to the beginning, one more thing about that morning at Mayerling is worth sitting with. The men who broke down that door did not go straight to Stephanie. They went to the Emperor's own chamberlain first, and the chamberlain went to Franz Joseph. And only after Father and Emperor had absorbed the news in private did anyone turn to the question of what to tell the Crown Princess, and how much of it. That order of operations, family and empire, informed before wife, tells you almost everything you need to know about where Stephanie actually stood in the household she had spent 8 years trying to belong to. If you want the rest of this family's buried women told with the same care, this is the channel for it, so take a moment now to subscribe, because there are a great many more of them still waiting, and this story is only getting started. Stephanie was born in Belgium in the spring of 1864, the second surviving daughter of King Leopold II, a monarch history remembers, when it remembers him at all outside Belgium, for what he later did to the Congo, a record of exploitation and violence so severe that even his own century, not an era known for its scruples about colonial rule, eventually found it difficult to defend. At home, he was a different kind of difficult. He treated his 3 daughters, Louise, Stephanie, and the much younger Clementine, as assets to be placed rather than children to be raised, and Stephanie in particular grew up aware that she was considered the plain one, next to an older sister accounted the beauty of the family, who would herself go on to marry into a minor branch of the same Habsburg web that eventually swallowed Stephanie, and whose own marriage would collapse into scandal, debt, and eventual confinement in an asylum arranged by her own relatives. A fate Stephanie would have every reason to remember once her own in-laws started deciding things on her behalf. Leopold's own private conduct offered his daughters a preview of exactly the kind of arrangement men of his rank considered acceptable. In his final years, he kept a mistress, Caroline Lacroix, decades younger than himself, installed her openly in properties he purchased for her, and left her a substantial fortune at his death, a pattern of an older, powerful man and a much younger woman that Stephanie would watch play out again, with far darker consequences, inside her own marriage. Their mother, Marie Henriette, was herself an Austrian archduchess by birth, a first cousin of Emperor Franz Joseph, which meant that when the marriage brokers began looking for a bride for the Austrian crown prince, Stephanie was not some exotic outsider being brought into the family. She was already half inside it by blood, and the match, when it was proposed, looked to both courts like the kind of alliance that barely needed negotiating, a tidy consolidation of connections that already existed. Marie Henriette's own marriage to Leopold had gone cold decades earlier, the two of them living largely separate lives inside the same palace, and by the time her daughters were old enough to notice, the household Stephanie grew up in already ran on the particular silence of two people who had stopped speaking to each other in any way that mattered. She learned the shape of an unhappy royal marriage before she was old enough to understand she was learning anything at all, simply by watching her own parents cross paths at state dinners like polite strangers. She met Rudolf for the first time at a ball in Brussels in the spring of 1880, when she was 15 and he was 21, and by most accounts, the meeting went well enough that the engagement was announced within days, an engagement Stephanie herself would later describe, in the memoir she did not write until she was an old woman with nothing left to lose by honesty, as something that happened to her rather than something she chose. She spent the following year being groomed for a role that terrified her, learning the etiquette of a court famous across Europe for the rigidity of its protocol, a court where the correct way to enter a room, the correct distance to stand from an archduchess, and the correct sequence in which 200 aristocratic families were permitted to be presented, had all been formalized down to rules descended from the old Spanish court ceremonial, rules that made the Vatican look relaxed by comparison. She had to learn German quickly and thoroughly enough to survive a court where a mangled sentence at the wrong dinner could become a season's worth of gossip, and she arrived in Vienna, a 15-year-old foreigner, expected to master, almost overnight, a language and a code of conduct that Habsburg archduchesses spent their whole childhoods absorbing. She was married in the Augustinian church in Vienna on the 10th of May, 1881, 16 years old, in a dress so heavy with embroidery that she reportedly had trouble standing through the ceremony. Rudolf was 22. Photographs from the wedding show a girl who looks younger than her age, standing next to a young man who looks, if you know what came after, faintly haunted even then, though that reading is almost certainly retrospective, the kind of meaning people impose on old photographs once they already know how the story ends. The early months in Vienna were not without genuine warmth. Letters from that first year show a young couple making a real effort, touring parts of the empire together. Rudolf apparently charmed enough by his new bride's earnestness to write to friends with cautious optimism about the marriage. It did not last. Within 2 years, the gap between them had widened into something neither of them seemed able, or particularly willing, to close. The wedding itself had been treated by both courts as a genuine diplomatic event, with crowds lining the route between the Hofburg and the church, and telegrams of congratulation arriving from every royal house in Europe. the kind of occasion that photographs and official portraits preserve as unambiguous triumph. What those portraits do not show is a Habsburg family that had already buried more than its share of catastrophe by the time Stephanie arrived in Vienna. Franz Joseph had survived an assassination attempt as a young man, stabbed in the neck by a nationalist on a Vienna street, and saved only by the stiff collar of his uniform. His younger brother Maximilian had been installed as Emperor of Mexico by French intervention, and then abandoned by his own allies, captured and shot by firing squad in 1867, a death Franz Joseph never fully discussed afterward. The family Stephanie married into had already learned, more than once, that titles offered no real protection against disaster, a lesson Rudolf himself seemed to carry somewhere underneath the charm he showed his new bride during those first hopeful months. What Stephanie did not know, walking into that marriage, was that she was marrying a man who had already spent years being slowly crushed by his own father's court, in ways that had nothing to do with her. Rudolf had been raised under a military education regime so harsh that even Franz Joseph's own advisors questioned it. Cold baths and rifle drills imposed on him from early childhood by a governor, Leopold Gondracourt, his father had selected specifically to toughen a boy the emperor considered too sensitive. A later, more sympathetic tutor, Colonel Joseph Latour von Thurmberg, undid some of the damage and encouraged the intellectual curiosity that would define Rudolf's adult life. But the early years left marks that friends and relatives noticed for the rest of his short one. He grew into an intelligent, restless, genuinely gifted young man, fluent in several languages, a serious amateur naturalist who corresponded with ornithologists across Europe and helped conceive and edit a vast multi-volume work on the natural history and peoples of the Austro-Hungarian crown lands, a project so ambitious that parts of it were still being published years after his death. Politically, he was a liberal in a court that ran on conservative Catholic orthodoxy and a rigid alliance with the aristocracy his father trusted completely, and Rudolf increasingly did not. He wanted a role in governing the empire he would one day inherit. His father gave him ceremonial military postings instead, and kept every door to actual influence closed, a pattern that would define the entire remainder of Rudolf's short life. Franz Joseph himself rose most mornings before 5, worked through state papers at a plain desk for hours before anyone else in the palace was awake, and ran the empire's business with a bureaucratic discipline he expected his son to absorb, without ever actually handing him any of the decisions that discipline was meant to prepare him for. A contradiction Rudolf complained about in private letters for years, without it ever once changing his father's mind. Frustrated and shut out, he began, secretly, writing political articles under other names for a liberal Viennese newspaper, edited by his friend Moritz Scheps, criticizing his own father's government from behind a screen of anonymity, a betrayal so dangerous that discovery would likely have meant real consequences for a crown prince supposedly loyal to the throne he stood to inherit. Stephanie, by her own later account, only partially understood any of this was happening. She had married into an inheritance dispute that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the two men she now lived between, a father and son locked in a quiet, unresolved war over who actually controlled the future of an empire, fought almost entirely in rooms she was not invited into. Some of that restlessness found an outlet, at least for a while, in travel. In the early 1880s, Rudolf undertook an extended research expedition through Egypt and parts of the Middle East, collecting specimens, recording observations on birds and local customs, and producing published writing that his fellow naturalists took seriously rather than dismissing as a royal hobbyist's diversion. It was the closest he came, in his short adult life, to work he had chosen for himself rather than work assigned to him by his father's court, and friends who travelled with him described a man visibly more at ease outside Vienna than inside it, a pattern that would only become more pronounced and more troubling as the decade wore on. The marriage produced one child, a daughter named Elizabeth Marie, born in September of 1883, and very little else in the way of warmth. The court's reaction to the birth was polite rather than celebratory, since a daughter did nothing to secure the succession the way a son would have, and Rudolf himself reportedly greeted the news with disappointment he did not fully bother to hide. Stephanie was young enough and hopeful enough to believe a son would follow in time. He never did. Rudolf's infidelities began early and were, by the standards of a court where royal husbands keeping mistresses was practically an institution, not in themselves unusual. What made Stephanie's situation different, and what nearly every biography of Rudolf treats as a matter of settled record, even though it was never openly discussed in its own time, is that at some point in the marriage's first years, Rudolf contracted gonorrhea, almost certainly from one of his affairs, and infected his wife. The infection is widely credited by historians, among them Brigitte Harman, whose biography of Rudolf remains one of the most thoroughly sourced accounts of his life, with leaving Stephanie unable to conceive again after Elizabeth Marie's birth, closing off any possibility of the son and heir apparent's wife was expected to provide, and effectively ending whatever functional partnership the marriage still had. Stephanie herself, decades later, wrote about her health in terms vague enough that historians have had to reconstruct the medical reality from court gossip, doctors' private notes, and the timing of her single pregnancy against everything that came after, rather than from any direct statement she was willing to put on paper. It was not the kind of thing a 19th-century crown princess wrote down plainly, even in a memoir otherwise candid about her own unhappiness. What she did write about plainly enough was the loneliness, the sense of being a fixture in a household rather than a partner in a marriage, invited to fewer and fewer of her husband's actual thoughts as the years went on, until the two of them were, in her own later description, little more than strangers sharing a roof and a title. Elizabeth Marie was 5 years old when her father died at Mayerling, old enough to notice the household around her had changed completely, but far too young to be told anything close to the truth, and for years afterward, the official explanation offered to the child herself remained the same sanitized version given to the wider public, a sudden illness rather than anything resembling the actual events in that hunting lodge. Franz Joseph, for his part, took a warmer interest in his granddaughter than he had ever shown his daughter-in-law, a pattern common enough in dynasties where the child represented the future in a way the child's mother, once she had served her reproductive purpose, generally did not. Elizabeth Marie grew up partly under her grandfather's personal attention, doted on in a way that only sharpened, for Stephanie, the sense that her own place in the family had always been conditional, tied to a role she had performed successfully exactly once and was not otherwise required for. By the middle of the 1880s, Rudolf's decline had become the kind of open secret that everyone at court noticed, and nobody with any power addressed. He drank heavily. He used morphine, initially prescribed for a chronic gonorrheal infection that never fully cleared, and for headaches that plagued him for years, and the drug use deepened alongside a depression that friends and relatives described in letters using words like melancholy and nervous exhaustion, the vocabulary available to people who did not yet have the word for what they were watching. He talked about death with a frequency that alarmed people close to him. Years before he ever met Mary Vetsera, he had reportedly proposed a suicide pact to at least one other woman, a Viennese actress named Midzi Kaspar, with whom he had a long-standing affair, and who, by her own later account, refused him and reported the conversation to the police, who apparently did not think a crown prince's talk of dying was worth pursuing any further. Doctors who treated him privately in his final 2 years left notes, some only rediscovered decades later, describing a patient in a state of nervous collapse brought on by a combination of chronic infection, heavy drinking, and morphine use severe enough that his hands reportedly shook too badly some mornings to hold a pen. A detail almost impossible to reconcile with the confident, photographed public image of a crown prince the empire's newspapers kept printing, right up until the end. He was, by nearly every surviving account, a man searching for an exit from a life that had given him a magnificent title and almost none of the substance he actually wanted. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, the woman history remembers as Sisi, understood some of this better than anyone at court, since she shared his restlessness and his contempt for Habsburg formality, and she had genuine intellectual sympathy for her son. She was also, by nearly every account of her own life, a mother who spent enormous stretches of every year travelling alone across Europe, chasing a punishing regimen of diet and exercise and a beauty routine that had become, by this point in her life, something closer to an obsession than a habit, rather than present in Vienna in any sustained way. Whatever understanding she offered Rudolf came in occasional letters and visits, rather than the sustained attention that might have changed anything. Stephanie, meanwhile, occupied an almost impossible position in the middle of all this, a wife increasingly shut out of her husband's inner life, aware that something in him was breaking, without the standing at court or the emotional access to do anything meaningful about it, and without a mother-in-law inclined to include her in whatever limited understanding she herself had of what her son was going through. Mary Vetsera entered the picture in the winter of 1887 into 1888, introduced into Rudolf's circle in part through her own ambitious mother, Helene Vetsera, a woman from the wealthy and socially climbing Baltazzi banking family, whose brothers, Mary's uncles, had made a fortune in Levantine trade and become notorious in Vienna for their horse racing exploits and their determination to buy their way into a social tier that old Austrian nobility was reluctant to grant them. Helene wanted, quite openly, a connection to the crown prince for her daughter, whatever form that connection might take, and she found a willing intermediary in Countess Marie Larisch, a cousin of Rudolf's, who arranged meetings between the two young people, and who would, in the years after Mayerling, spend much of the rest of her own life trying, and mostly failing, to profit from her role in the story, eventually dying in obscurity and poverty in the United States after decades of failed attempts to sell her version of events. The Baltazzi fortune was real and considerable. Mary's uncle, Erno Baltazzi, owned the racehorse Kisber, which had won both the Epsom Derby and the Grand Prix de Paris in the same season, a genuine sporting sensation that briefly made the family name famous across European racing circles, even as old Viennese nobility continued treating them as newly arrived money rather than a family with any claim to real standing. Mary herself had been educated largely at home and in a convent school, raised on the same diet of romantic literature that shaped a great many aristocratic girls of her generation, and by most accounts she had noticed Rudolf, and been noticed in return, at the opera and at the Prater racecourse, well before Larisch ever formally arranged an introduction between them. Mary was 17, striking, romantic in the specific overheated way of a teenager raised on novels about grand passion, and she fell for Rudolf with an intensity that reads, in her surviving letters, as genuinely sincere, rather than calculated, whatever her mother's ambitions may have been. The affair deepened across 1888, conducted through secret meetings arranged by Larisch, an exchange of letters and small gifts, and the particular thrill, for a 17-year-old from a family still fighting for full acceptance among the old aristocracy, of being chosen by the heir to the throne itself. Rudolf, by this point, was talking about death constantly, to Mary and to others, and at some point in that final winter, the conversation between the two of them turned from an affair into something else, a shared fixation on dying together that Mary appears to have embraced with the same intensity she brought to everything else about the relationship, though the exact balance of who wanted it more, whether this was a genuine mutual pact or something closer to Rudolf leading a teenager who trusted him toward a decision she did not fully understand the finality of, is a question historians still argue over, and one that this account will not pretend to settle with more certainty than the evidence allows. On the evening of the 28th of January 1889, Rudolf travelled to Mayerling, his hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, ostensibly for a shooting party, with several friends and his brother-in-law Philip of Coburg. Mary Vetsera was smuggled to the lodge separately, hidden under a rug in a carriage, arranged with the help of Rudolf's own coachman, and, according to most accounts, with at least the passive complicity of Countess Larisch, who had helped arrange several of their earlier meetings, and who would later insist, not entirely convincingly, that she had no idea what the two of them intended. What happened over the following hours inside that lodge is reconstructed today from a handful of letters the two of them wrote before the end, several found on the scene, and several delivered afterward to family members, and from the forensic evidence gathered by the small number of officials permitted to examine the room before the imperial family's own machinery of concealment began working to control what the public would ever be allowed to know. Rudolf wrote farewell letters to his wife, to his mother, to his sister Valerie, and to Mary's mother, letters whose exact content has been debated and occasionally embellished across a century of retellings, but which historians broadly agree conveyed a man at peace with the decision he had made and asking forgiveness he did not expect to receive. Mary wrote her own letters to her mother and to her sister, expressing something closer to joyful certainty about dying beside the man she loved, a certainty that, whatever it says about her state of mind at 17, this account will not romanticize as the two of them believed it should be romanticized. Sometime before dawn, on the 30th of January, Rudolf shot Mary. The evidence, including a forensic examination of what were believed to be her remains conducted in 2015, points to a single gunshot wound consistent with the traditional account, though questions about the handling and authenticity of those remains across the decades since her original burial have complicated any claim to absolute certainty. Much of what is known about the physical evidence at all comes from a 1968 investigation by the Austrian researcher Fritz Uthmann, who tracked down surviving police and court records decades after the fact, and from the later work of journalist and historian Georg Marcus, whose book on the case remains one of the most careful attempts to separate documented fact from the century of rumor that grew up around it. He then sat with her body for hours before turning the gun on himself, a sequence reconstructed from the position of the bodies, the state of the room, and the timeline the valet later gave of a light seen under the door well into the night. There have been conspiracy theories for more than a century, versions involving assassins, poachers, jealous husbands, foreign agents, even the involvement of the Empress herself in some of the wilder tellings, and none of them have ever produced evidence that has held up against the physical record. The Habsburg court did not need a conspiracy to explain what happened at Mayerling. It needed something far more difficult, which was a way to survive the truth without letting the public, the church, or the empire's own line of succession collapse under the weight of it. Before the second half of this story, the part where Stephanie has to actually live through what the court decided to do with the truth, take a moment and consider what this channel is trying to do more broadly, which is give the women written out of their own marriages the length and the detail their husbands always got by default. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of history, and consider this the middle marker, because everything from here gets harder to watch. The first version of events sent to Vienna, the one that reached Stephanie that morning, was that Rudolf had died suddenly of heart failure, a story constructed within hours by the small circle of officials who had reached Mayerling first, and understood immediately that the real facts could not simply be announced. Empress Elizabeth was told the fuller truth relatively quickly, and it fell to her, not to Franz Joseph directly, and certainly not to any official messenger, to be the one who eventually told Stephanie what had actually happened, that her husband had died by his own hand, in the company of a mistress Stephanie had not previously known existed. Accounts of that conversation, drawn from people close to both women at the time, describe Cece's manner as formal, to the point of coldness, even in delivering news of this magnitude, consistent with a relationship between the two women that had never been warm, and that Cece had made little effort to disguise across 8 years of watching her son's marriage from a distance. Whatever grief Stephanie was entitled to as a widow, she was made to receive it inside a family that had, in the person of her mother-in-law, already begun deciding how much of the truth she deserved and in what tone it would be delivered. What followed was a machine built for one purpose, which was to make Rudolf's suicide survivable for an empire, and above all, survivable for the Catholic Church, whose rites forbade full funeral honours to a suicide. A small number of doctors, under pressure that has been documented in surviving correspondence among the officials involved, signed a certificate attributing Rudolf's actions to a state of mental unsoundness at the moment of the act. A medically dubious finding that nonetheless allowed the Vatican to permit a full church funeral, an outcome the imperial family considered non-negotiable. Rudolf was buried among his ancestors in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna. With the full state ceremony, an heir to the throne was due, an outcome that took days of negotiation between the palace and Rome to secure, and that Franz Joseph pursued with an intensity that had far more to do with dynastic dignity than with any particular tenderness toward the son he had spent 2 decades holding at arm's length. The Austrian press was placed under direct instruction about what could and could not be printed, and for years afterward, the official version available to ordinary subjects of the empire remained vague to the point of uselessness. A sudden death, a weak heart, nothing more. None of which stopped the truth from spreading anyway, in the way truth generally does when a government tries to suppress something several hundred people already partly know. Foreign newspapers, outside the reach of Austrian censorship, printed versions of events within days, and copies made their way back into Vienna, regardless of what the palace wanted its own subjects reading. It would take more than 2 decades for anything close to the full story to reach a wide public, and when it finally did, in 1913, the source was not the Habsburg family or the Austrian state, but Marie Lariche herself, publishing a memoir of her own, titled My Past, that laid out her version of the events at Mayerling in exchange for whatever income the book could still generate for a woman the family had long since cut off financially. The Habsburg court tried unsuccessfully to suppress it. Mary Vetsera received no such consideration. Her body was removed from Mayerling in the middle of the night by her own uncles, propped upright between them in a carriage, and dressed as though she were simply an unwell woman being escorted home, so that anyone who happened to see the carriage pass would see nothing more alarming than a family managing a sick relative. She was buried in a hurried, minimally attended ceremony at the nearby Heiligenkreuz Abbey, without her mother present for the burial itself, and without the funeral honours any young woman's family would normally expect, a final indignity layered onto a death the court had already decided the public would understand only in the vaguest possible terms. Her family, the Baltazzis and the Vetseras alike, found themselves pushed to the margins of Viennese society in the years that followed, tainted by an association none of them had chosen, and none of them were ever permitted to explain publicly, since the official story required Mary to remain, for decades, little more than a footnote in a tragedy that had actually cost her everything. Stephanie, meanwhile, was required to perform the specific, exacting grief of a Habsburg crown princess widow in front of an entire court that already knew, or would very soon know, exactly what she was grieving and exactly how little of that grief the situation actually called for on her account, given how distant the marriage had already become. She wore the black of official mourning for a husband who had spent his final months writing letters of devotion to a 17-year-old girl, and she did it under the gaze of a Viennese aristocracy fluent in the particular cruelty of gossip, conducted entirely through correct manners and lowered voices. Franz Joseph, grieving the loss of his only son and the collapse of the succession he had spent decades assuming would pass smoothly to Rudolf, had little emotional bandwidth left over for his daughter-in-law, and what limited warmth existed between Stephanie and the wider Habsburg family had never been strong enough to survive a crisis of this magnitude. She found herself, within days of becoming a widow, functionally alone inside the largest, most rigidly hierarchical court in Europe, expected to carry a loyalty to a marriage that had already ended, in every sense that mattered, before the 2 shots at Mayerling made the ending official. For weeks she received a steady procession of ambassadors and foreign relatives, arriving to offer formal condolences, each visit requiring the correct words, the correct expression, the correct amount of time given to a grief the visitors themselves mostly assumed was straightforward: a young widow devastated by the sudden loss of a beloved husband. Stephanie sat through all of it, knowing a fuller version of events that she was not permitted to discuss, managing, visit after visit, a story that was not entirely hers, about a marriage that had not been what any of the sympathetic faces in front of her imagined it to be. It was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of performance, one she had not auditioned for and could not decline. The years that followed were, for Stephanie, a slow demonstration of exactly how much status a Habsburg court was willing to extend to a widow it no longer had any use for. Her position as Crown Princess widow came with title and precedence, but very little actual influence, and control over her own daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was largely absorbed by the imperial household rather than left to Stephanie herself, following the standard Habsburg practice of raising archducal children under the direct supervision of the court rather than a surviving parent considered insufficiently central to the dynasty. Mother and daughter grew distant across the years that followed, a distance that would only widen once Elizabeth Marie reached adulthood and developed political sympathies far removed from the world she had been born into, eventually earning the nickname the Red Archduchess for her socialist leanings and her friendship with prominent figures of the Austrian left, a reputation that put her at odds with almost everyone else in her family, including, for long stretches, her own mother. The succession, meanwhile, passed not to any child of Rudolf's, but sideways through the family to Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an inheritance of the Crown Prince title that would end, a quarter-century later, in Sarajevo, with an assassination that helped ignite a war which finished off the empire Rudolf had died trying, in his own broken way, to reform. It is one of the odder footnotes of European history that the bullet Rudolf fired into his own temple in a hunting lodge in 1889 set in motion, through a chain of succession nobody intended, the exact circumstances that put a different Habsburg heir in an open car in Sarajevo 25 years later. Franz Ferdinand himself would go on to marry a woman the Habsburg court considered beneath him, Countess Sophie Chotek, a match permitted only after he agreed to a formal renunciation, ensuring their children could never inherit the throne, and one that condemned Sophie to a lifetime of walking several steps behind other archduchesses at court functions, denied the royal honours her own husband carried without a second thought. The family that had spent a decade punishing Stephanie for a marriage of genuine, if scandalous, equality was, at almost the exact same moment, inventing new ways to punish another woman for the opposite offence, marrying an heir who actually wanted her. Franz Joseph himself outlived his only son by 27 years, ruling on through the assassination of the nephew who had replaced Rudolf as heir, and into the opening years of the war. That assassination helped start, dying in 1916 with Austria-Hungary already deep in a conflict that would finish the empire within 2 more years. He was succeeded briefly by Karl I, the same emperor who would eventually grant Eleanor Lonier his princely title, before the monarchy itself was abolished altogether in 1918, and the family that had once controlled Stephanie's every public gesture lost the throne that had made all of it matter in the first place. For roughly a decade after Mayerling, Stephanie lived inside that reduced arrangement, present enough at official Habsburg occasions to fulfill her formal duties, absent from anything resembling real influence or real warmth. The title itself came with an allowance fixed by the court rather than negotiated by her, apartments assigned rather than chosen, and a place in official processions calculated down to the exact step behind whichever archduchess currently outranked her, a precedence chart Stephanie had once expected to eventually stand at the very top of, and now found herself permanently frozen several places below, a demotion nobody needed to announce out loud, because the seating arrangements said it clearly enough on their own. She was watched constantly, judged for how she dressed, how long she wore black, how quickly or slowly she returned to public life. Every choice read by a court fluent in interpreting exactly that kind of signal as either appropriate deference to the dead or unseemly haste to move on. There was no version of mourning available to her that would have satisfied everyone, and she seems to have understood, well before the decade was out, that satisfying the court had stopped being a goal worth pursuing. The decade brought the family one more catastrophe that had nothing directly to do with Stephanie and everything to do with the particular pattern of loss that seemed to follow the Habsburgs regardless of who married in or out of the family. In September of 1898, Empress Elizabeth was stabbed to death on a quay in Geneva by an Italian anarchist who later said he had simply been looking for any prominent royal target and had happened to find Sisi first. Franz Joseph, who had already buried his brother, his son, and now his wife, inside a span of little more than 30 years, absorbed the loss the way he absorbed everything by this point in his reign, with a rigid, outward composure that gave away almost nothing, and Stephanie, still formally a member of a family that had never fully accepted her, found herself once again on the margins of a mourning that belonged, by every rule the court still enforced, to people ranked well above her. Then, in 1899, she did something almost nobody in her position was supposed to do. She fell in love, on her own terms this time, with a Hungarian nobleman named Eleanor Lonier, a man of respectable but distinctly non-royal standing, and in the spring of 1900 she married him, over the furious objections of nearly everyone with a stake in her remaining a proper, decorative Habsburg widow for the rest of her life. Her own father, King Leopold, who had treated her as a piece on a diplomatic chessboard from the moment she was old enough to be married off, responded to news of a match he considered beneath her by disinheriting her, cutting his own daughter out of the family fortune over a marriage she had chosen entirely for herself, a final confirmation of exactly how little her own happiness had ever factored into his calculations regarding her, consistent with the way he was, around this same period, treating his other daughters and openly favouring the mistress he installed in his final years over any of the 3 women he had actually raised. The Habsburg court's response was scarcely warmer. A marriage to a man without royal blood violated the family's rules governing whom a former crown princess was permitted to marry while retaining her full status, and Stephanie found herself, at the moment she finally exercised the one choice of her adult life that was entirely her own, stripped of privileges and largely written out of the family that had spent nearly 2 decades treating her as a fixture rather than a person. She and Lonier settled primarily in Hungary, at an estate away from the Viennese court, whose approval she had finally, deliberately, stopped seeking, and by every account that survives of their marriage, including her own, it was a genuinely happy one, quiet in exactly the way her first marriage had never been permitted to be. Lonye had served in the Hungarian Foreign Service and moved in exactly the kind of respectable, moneyed circles that made him an entirely reasonable match for almost anyone, except a former crown princess bound by Habsburg house law, and the two of them built their life together at his family estate at Orosvar, raising horses and receiving guests on terms Stephanie set for herself, rather than terms handed down from the Hofburg. In 1917, with a new and somewhat more sympathetic emperor on the throne in Karl I, Lonye was elevated to the rank of prince, a gesture that came far too late to undo 2 decades of being treated as unsuitable, but that at least closed the gap, on paper, between the rank Stephanie had married into and the rank her second husband actually held. History was not finished complicating even that arrangement. After the First World War redrew the map of Central Europe, the treaty settlements of the early 1920s placed Orosvar outside the new, much smaller Hungary altogether, inside the newly formed Czechoslovakia, so that the estate Stephanie and her husband had built as a refuge from Habsburg control ended up, through no choice of their own, on the far side of a border neither of them had asked to see redrawn. She spent the following decades largely outside the glare of the dynasty that had defined her youth, watching from a distance as the empire she had once been due to rule as its future empress dissolved after the First World War, as the Habsburgs lost their throne entirely, and as the world that had once demanded she explain herself to it simply stopped existing. Her daughter's life, meanwhile, moved in a direction almost nobody at the old court could have predicted. Elizabeth Marie married Prince Otto zu Windisch-Gratz in 1902, had 4 children with him, and eventually divorced him in the 1920s, drifting steadily toward the socialist politics that would earn her the Red Archduchess nickname and a genuine friendship with figures in the Austrian left, the rest of the family regarded as beneath contempt. Mother and daughter, both women who had married young into arrangements that served other people's purposes, and both of whom eventually broke from what was expected of them, never fully repaired the distance that had opened between them in the years right after Mayerling, though later correspondence suggests something closer to mutual respect crept in once both of them were simply 2 women who had each, in their own very different ways, refused to keep playing the part they had been assigned. She wrote her memoir in the 1930s, in her 70s by then, and titled it I Was to Be Empress, a book that laid out, with a bluntness that would have been unthinkable for the 16-year-old bride of 1881, exactly how unhappy the marriage had been, how coldly she had been treated by Sisi, and how little the court that had once demanded her perfect mourning had ever actually cared what became of her once the performance was over. The book found readers across Europe and America precisely because it broke a silence that had held for close to 50 years, offering the first widely read account of Mayerling, written by someone who had actually been inside the family when it happened, rather than by an outside journalist or historian working from second-hand testimony. She did not spare Sisi in its pages, describing a mother-in-law who had never troubled to make her feel welcome and who treated the entire marriage, from the earliest days, as a diplomatic obligation rather than a relationship worth investing any real warmth in. A portrait considerably less flattering than the romantic, misunderstood empress that popular memory had already started constructing around Sisi by the time Stephanie finally put her own account into print. It was not universally welcomed. Royalist circles still loyal to the memory of the old empire accused her of airing family business that ought to have stayed private, the same complaint, more or less, that had been used for decades to keep women in her position silent in the first place. And Stephanie, by then in her 70s and answerable to no court that still had any real power over her, appears to have found the complaint far less persuasive than it would once have been. She survived long enough to watch a Second World War begin and to watch the marriage she had built for herself outlast, by decades, the empire that had once tried to define her entirely by it. She died at Pannonhalma in Hungary in August of 1945, in the chaotic final months of that war, with Soviet forces already occupying the country, and the world she had been born into entirely gone. The family fortune and the estate she and Lonier had built together largely lost in the upheaval that came with the Red Army's arrival. She was buried there, not in the Habsburg crypt in Vienna, where the family she had married into rests, and not beside the husband whose death had once required her to grieve on command for an empire that never much liked her, but in the country and the marriage she had actually chosen for herself. The title of her memoir sounds, at first read, like the lament of a woman defined entirely by the crown she never wore, and for years that was more or less how history read it, another royal widow measuring her whole life against a lost destiny. Read against everything she actually did after Mayerling, marrying for love against her father's wishes, walking away from a court that had spent a decade making her account for a husband's choices that were never hers to answer for, and building a life on her own terms in the country that would eventually become her home rather than her exile. It reads differently. She was never going to become empress. What she became instead, after Vienna finished asking her to explain a tragedy that belonged to everyone but her, was something the court that raised her had never once considered preparing her for. She became, at long last, a woman who got to choose. The 20th century, once it got hold of Mayerling, mostly agreed with the court's original instinct to make this a story about Rudolf and Mary rather than about Stephanie. Filmmakers returned to the doomed pair repeatedly across the decades, first in a 1936 French production, then again in a 1968 version with an international cast, and a British choreographer eventually turned the same material into a full-length ballet, each retelling leaning further into romance and tragedy, and further away from the wife who spent the following 56 years actually living with what the affair had cost her. Stephanie, in most of these versions, appears for a scene or two if she appears at all, generally as an obstacle to a love story rather than as a person the story had happened to as well. There is a version of this story, the one Vienna preferred at the time, and the one plenty of retellings still default to, in which Stephanie is a minor character in her own marriage, a placeholder bride whose main function was to be publicly humiliated and then to disappear from the narrative once the more romantic pairing of Rudolf and Mary took center stage. That version requires leaving out everything that happened after the 30th of January 1889, the decade of managed grief, the daughter raised mostly out of her hands, the father who disowned her for choosing her own husband, and the court that punished her for the one decision in the entire story that was actually hers. Put that decade back in, and the woman being asked to explain Mayerling to Vienna starts to look less like a footnote and more like the only person in the entire affair who eventually answered on her own terms rather than the court's. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the marriages that were treaties before they were ever love, and the women who were made to answer for husbands they barely knew, there is a great deal more of the Habsburg archive still waiting to be told. So stay subscribed and stay close, because the next one is coming.